Wyvern Falls is a rather interesting place, filled with all manner of interesting characters. Long before the Vesovian Empire existed, Wyvern Falls was established as a small trading post between the long-lost dwarven kingdom of Nandarloon and the former human kingdom of Krolan. In Etia, the same as Earth I suppose, trading posts tend to attract a variety of people from all over for a variety of business ventures, legal or not. Krolan, the kingdom and the city itself, eventually became part of the expanding Vesovian Empire, but the kingdom of Nandarloon and many of the dwarves within fell centuries before. I'm afraid I cannot tell you what exactly caused their demise, as I know very little about that ancient history, but I do know that it is widely rumored the ruins of that great kingdom still lie somewhere beneath the Kulak Mountains. Many young and brash adventurer types have spent days searching through the various mines and tunnels left behind in hopes of stumbling upon the path to those ruins and the supposed riches left waiting, but as far as I know, none have found it. Most dwarves in Etia now reside in the relatively new kingdom of Udramore across the sea. I say relatively because Udramore itself was also hundreds of years old by the time I was born, but if there are any dwarves in Etia who still know the location of Nandarloon, they aren't sharing it. Though there is a waterfall just south of the city where the Delgar River comes crashing down out of the Kulak Mountains before winding its way around Wyvern Falls, it might surprise you to learn that the city is not named for it, but for actual wyverns falling from the sky. Sometime after the founding of the trading post here, it was attacked by a large flight of wyverns that had previously made this hilly landscape their home. The initial attacks were brutal and many industrious merchants lost their lives, but humans are a rather stubborn lot on any world, and it seems they refused to abandon the location. Soldiers were sent, a military outpost was built, and city walls were erected throughout the next few years to defend the post from the creatures with varying degrees of success. The tipping point came when large ballistas were finally installed in the stone towers around the city. With these weapons, the soldiers were finally able to get the upper hand on their winged nemesis, and many wyverns quite literally fell from the sky. With the city finally secure, the soldiers were able to begin taking the fight to the beasts. For years, they hunted throughout the surrounding hills and destroyed any they came across until eventually there were just no more to be found. The city had grown quite a bit since then. Though they were no longer needed to fend off wyverns, the weapons had been relocated to the newer towers along the city's current boundary. Many of the original towers still stand as reminders of where the city had begun, but I was not heading into the city on this night. My destination was a lonely tower nestled in the densely forested hills just a couple miles west of the city, the Temple of Minera, goddess of magic. I had no idea what sort of trap he'd set for me there, but I was sure he had planned something, and I wasn't about to rush in blindly. I stretched forth my senses, looking for any four-legged allies in the area that could show me exactly what was behind all those trees, and watched through their eyes as they approached close enough to see the tower. It was actually more than just a single tower. There was a small cluster of small buildings scattered loosely around what served as a central courtyard with a walkway leading up to the temple entrance itself. These smaller buildings would be where the various priests and acolytes lived and worked when they were not actively holding services within the temple itself. Through the wolves' eyes, I could not see anyone moving about. The entire place seemed quiet. It looked all but abandoned at first glance, but the wolves could smell men and were reluctant to move any closer. I knew someone was there, but it was impossible to know exactly where or how many. It was frustrating, but I ordered the wolves to stay and keep watch as I began to make my own way through the forest. They sat quietly hidden in the trees and had seen nothing for a long time, but as I finally began to close in on the small clearing, one of them spotted movement and perked up to watch. There, in the darkness, were two figures dressed in dark clothing, passing from one small building to another. The larger figure seemed to be pushing the slightly smaller one ahead, while the smaller one kept resisting the movement. A wolf's sight isn't bad, but it is no match for their sense of smell, and unfortunately they were too far away to be seen or smelled clearly. From this distance, they were just two figures in the night. My hunch told me this was what I was looking for. The larger figure, Asher, was pushing and leading the smaller figure, my Celine, into this small building. But why? Something wasn't quite right here. I could sense it. Asher had presumably had all day to prepare for my arrival. Surely by nightfall, he'd have had everything ready and be quietly hiding in his chosen place. Why would he be moving about now? Had something in his plan changed, or had he just grown impatient at my tardiness? It was, after all, approaching midnight, If he had been waiting since nightfall, then he'd have been waiting for hours by now with no sign of me. Or was it a trap? Did he know that I was watching somehow? If he did, why show me the girl at all? Surely he would know that from out here, I had no way of telling which building she was in. No way of knowing which one he was in either. So why show me by moving around now unless he was baiting me to follow? But that assumed he knew I was out here watching, and how could he? At the moment, I wasn't watching. The wolves were. If he had some sort of farsight, he would see nothing but a few wild wolves sitting in the forest. Nothing particularly strange about that, unless... Of course. What a foolish mistake I had made. He must think I was one of them. I had learned that I couldn't shapeshift, but there was very little chance that he would know that. He would still believe the usual myths. He would be looking for a wolf or a bat or some sort of strange mist to float into the clearing. He was waiting for a vampire, wasn't he? It's why he had chosen holy ground to begin with, wasn't it? He thought I couldn't reach him there. The question was he right? Like all the other myths about my kind, I had also heard that we could not tread upon holy ground. But I had buried that innocent girl in the graveyard. I hadn't had any problem there. Wasn't that holy ground? Actually, I didn't know. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just the chapel itself. As I've said, during my life I had had little use for the gods. I knew of them and their stories, of course, most people do, but I didn't spend much time worshiping them or learning their ways. So I had no idea how or why one piece of ground was holy while another place was not. Perhaps the graveyard hadn't been consecrated or blessed or whatever. Or maybe it had been, but it was dedicated to a god or goddess that didn't affect me. I had no idea, and I could spend the whole night pondering the infinite number of questions that came to mind, but I wasn't going to get answers to any of them just standing here in the woods. I needed to know for sure, and I didn't want to find out at the wrong moment. I needed to test it where Asher could not see. After giving my watcher a friendly scratch, I left him to watch where Asher had gone and circled around to the far side of the little encampment before approaching any closer. I made my way slowly, cautiously, waiting for any sign of discomfort or alarm. I had no idea what might happen. I suppose I was expecting the same sort of uneasiness my body seems to feel as the morning sun begins to creep toward the horizon, but I felt nothing of the sort. With even more caution, I took my first step within the clearing. If there was holy ground somewhere, I assumed it would extend from the temple to the tree line. But I still felt nothing and kept taking one cautious step after another toward one of the small buildings. I had now gone about 10 or 15 steps inside the little clearing, crouching low to stay as hidden as possible, and yet I still felt nothing at all. The question was settled for now, at least. Either this was not holy ground, or that was just another false myth about my kind, for clearly I could walk here unhindered. Content that I could walk right up to the building if I wanted, I quietly used the shadows and the darkness to make my way back around toward the building I assumed he had disappeared into, and an idea occurred to me. I now knew that I could walk here unhindered, but did Asher know it as well? Unless he had had more interactions with my kind than most people, I doubted he would know any more than the traditional myths. That would explain why he'd chosen this place, wouldn't it? He thought himself safe here. I could use that to my advantage. If he knew I couldn't come in there, then he must have planned to come out to meet me. Probably right there on the eastern path coming out of the woods. Seemed like the most obvious avenue of approach to me. I would have certainly put a trap there if I were him. But would he have expected me to approach from the deep forest to the west? I made my way to that side of the little compound and took a position just at the tree line where I was sure he would be able to see me. I was never particularly good at it, but I would have to do a little acting to sell this ploy. Hopefully it was convincing enough. The danger, of course, was that to be seen by Asher, I would also be obvious to any others within, and I had no way of knowing how many there were. I assumed they were priests, and though the holy ground thing had proven false, I was pretty sure I would find that I was not immune to priests wielding divine magic, but it was a risk I had to take. There was just no way for me to alert Asher without also alerting them. Now, to use his ignorance against him and hope for the best. I silently ordered the various wolves in the near vicinity to let out a long howl that echoed through the surrounding forests. The howl of a single wolf in the night was hardly an alarming thing unless you were a livestock farmer, but the howl of several echoing from every direction was sure to alert anyone that something was amiss. If he thought I was disguised as a wolf, then he would assume the howling was me communicating with the others nearby. That would tempt him outside to have a look. And it did. Shortly after the howls began to subside, the door I had seen him disappear into slowly swung open, and a barely discernible figure poked his head out to look around the small clearing. I took a single step forward from behind my tree so that he could see my full figure in the waxing moonlight, and he must have, for the door opened wide and he stepped out into the night, dragging the small hooded figure out behind him. For a few moments, neither of us moved. We simply stared through the darkness at each other as the tension grew. I could feel the hate growing within me at the sight of him. I wanted so badly to just run down there and tear him limb from limb, but it wasn't time for that just yet. Patience, I chided myself. Always patience. I began my little act of pacing back and forth just outside the line of the clearing. I made a show of trying to enter at various points, but recoiling quickly as soon as I breached the circle. Hopefully, he was just smart enough to think that I could not enter, and not smart enough to realize I was faking. Finally, after 3 or 4 attempts as I paced back and forth, I stopped and stood glaring down at him as though I simply could not come forward into the circle, and I watched as he began to approach me with a triumphant smile on his face, dragging and pushing the other figure with him. When he finally stopped, maybe 20 or 30 feet from me, he pulled down the hood and revealed what I had already assumed. The hooded figure was my Celine. He had her hands bound and a cloth gag over her mouth, but there was no mistaking those big, beautiful dark eyes behind the disheveled raven hair. "I thought I had killed you months ago," Asher began. "When I left Calborn, you were face down in a pool of your own blood, gasping your last breath. The castle was surrounded, the gates breached, and Vesovian troops were beating down the doors of the keep. It was all but over when I crossed the drawbridge and began my journey back to..." He paused here, obviously reluctant to reveal too much. "The Thorns," I finished for him. He smiled and bowed slightly at the name, acknowledging what I had already suspected. He was not your average mercenary assassin. He belonged to the Black Thorns, the most infamous guild of assassins in all of Etia. Emperor Kosan had clearly hired the best assassins he could. The Thorns were exceptional killers, but they did hold to their code. The only way to stop a Thorn contract was to kill the assassin they sent. Quite difficult to do, as you could never be sure who the assassin was until they strike. Thorns are everywhere. Your own mother could be one of them, and you wouldn't know it. However, if you survived their attempt and killed their agent, the contract was void, and they would not accept another on the same target. In other words, they will try once, and only once. The marker was paid, congratulations offered, and respect earned. So you can imagine my surprise when word arrived that the Battle of Calborn Castle was lost, and the Count still lived. Imagine my shame when they came to strip me of my just rewards because they assumed I had failed. His voice grew louder and more aggressive as he talked. "No one was more certain of your death than I," he spat. "Imagine my shame as my membership was revoked because they assumed I had lied. You took everything from me," he exclaimed. Now it was my turn to smile. "You place the blame on me, but you know the truth. It is you failed assassin, for as you can see, I am still alive," I taunted. He was clearly angry already. What I wanted was a blind rage. If he was furious enough, he would forget about the girl and leap at me. That was exactly what I had hoped for. Unfortunately, that was not the reaction I got. "Are you now?" he asked with a smirk. "I admit," he went on coolly, "I had my doubts when word first came that you were not dead. I thought that perhaps I had failed, but I had to know for sure. So I returned to Dibbleburg. I blended in with the townsfolk and kept quiet. I watched, I listened, and I waited," he said. "If you were alive, I knew you would still be close by. You wouldn't just leave these people to their fate. No, not you, the big war hero," he mocked. "Lucky for you that the Vesovian commanders are not terribly observant," he explained. "When they found the body of their comrade hidden under the tarp in the wagon, they assumed resistance from the villagers. When they found a second in an empty house, they confirmed their own assumptions, and of course administered their usual warning," he said, referring to the crucifixions. "When they found a third the following morning, they again rushed to conclusions and saw only what they wanted to see," he went on. "You had fooled them, but you hadn't deceived me. There was something different about these bodies, something obvious if you cared enough to look. That was my first clue, he smiled, as though he were proud of his investigative genius. But I still couldn't be sure, he went on, reveling in the captive audience he currently had. It is one thing to read stories about such things, quite another to believe those stories hold any truth. But when your army came down the hillside in the moonlight, I knew all I needed to know. He grinned as though he were the most clever man in the world. I hadn't failed at all, he said, looking back at me. You were dead. Dead, you say, and yet here I stand, clearly not. Some detective work. I mocked him with a chuckle of my own. Perhaps, he jeered, but neither are you alive. So I am clearly not dead, and yet you've still concluded that I am not alive? I asked in a condescending tone. Then what, pray tell, do you imagine me to be? You are the undead, he declared, one of the unholy blood-sucking parasites of the night. I paused for just a moment before I let out a loud, hearty laugh, both to give me time to think and to infuriate him further. He wasn't wrong, of course. That is exactly what I had become, but I didn't want to scare my beloved with that information just yet. It was better for me to simply pretend as though he were spinning fiction out of thin air. I'm sorry, I said as my laughter paused briefly. Do you really expect us to believe those old fairy tales? I asked, indicating both Celine and myself. That cursed beings that are neither dead nor alive walk Etia every night, mindlessly in search of blood to sustain their own non-living existence. Mystical beings so powerful that they can fly around the night in the form of bats, creep under your door as a cool mist while you slumber, hypnotize their victims with but a glance, and yet are held at bay with simple cloves of garlic. Not only do you expect us to believe these things are real, but you believe that I am one of them. I couldn't help laughing some more. Is this the excuse you gave your guild when they found out you simply failed? I did not fail, he bellowed angrily. But you did, I kept taunting. Here I am, the walking, talking proof. No, you are the walking, talking proof that I succeeded. That is why you are stuck there, he said, motioning toward the ground. You cannot walk upon this holy ground. The shock in his eyes when I took that first step forward was delicious, and it was my turn to smile. As I took another and another, I could hear his heartbeat quicken. He had misjudged something, and now he knew it. He was not as safe as he supposed himself to be. With each step, his heartbeat raced, and I grew more confident. But then I heard something. Nekmotas. There was a flash, and suddenly my entire body felt like it was made of stone. I could not move, and the smile that had been on my face was replaced by a grin on his. In his hand, there was a very small iron rod that emanated a slight blue glow, and for a moment, my unbeating heart became even colder. He knew the arcane arts, so I was not the only one with a secret. Clearly, I had also miscalculated my foe, and my mind raced to formulate a new plan. If it is redemption you seek, then come, I urged him. Come. Let the girl go and come finish your murder. Regain your order's respect. This is between you and I. She has no place here, I added. I had no fear of him for myself. Whether he could or could not destroy me was irrelevant at this point. I simply wanted to get her out of the way before something... Redemption, he spat. I need no redemption, bloodsucker. I killed you before, and I shall do so again. But not before I've had my revenge, he added as a devious grin crept across his face. He grabbed Celine and held her tightly from behind. His blade flashed in the moonlight as he placed it to her neck. No! What followed seemed to play out in slow motion in my mind. The smile on his face grew wider, his eyes sparkled with malice, the blade slowly creating a thin crimson line as it scraped across her exposed throat. Her eyes, at first wide with fear, turned to agonizing pain and despair as the thin red line grew thicker and the river of blood began to flow. When the cut was finished, he did not let her head drop, but held it high so I could stare helplessly as life slowly faded from those beautiful dark eyes. When he finally let the body drop, my heart, my very soul dropped with it. Everything I wanted, everything I dreamed of, all of my hope was lost in that single instant, and the weight upon my soul was too much to bear. Right then, all I wanted was to die with her. Now you know something of my pain, Asher declared as he advanced toward me with blade in hand. I only wish that I could leave you to suffer this pain forever. But I'm afraid I need your head, he said as he casually knocked my still frozen body to the ground. What happened next is a bit of a mystery to me. Lying on the ground, unable to move my head, I could not see anything but Asher standing over me as he drew a short sword from a scabbard slung across his back. He uttered the phrase, Eplios tolpu mi maxia mat. It is an ancient Etian language that very few are familiar with, but it was similar enough to Elven that I understood the general meaning of the phrase, if not all the words. He was asking for Iplios' aid to destroy me, and judging by the white glow that now encompassed the blade, the Lightbringer had granted his request. But the blade never fell. From somewhere out of my sight came some mumbling that I could not make out. A bright flash right in front of me, searing pain, and then my whole world went dark.